Nick Dyer, it is such an honor to have this conversation, one of our episodes of Conversations Leaders That Aren't Having that. And, we've been working together for 2 years, a little over 2 years. And you're the first guest on the series who has actually been a partner, a client. And so I'm excited for us to dive in and just explore in a unique way, because I have an inside view of it, but in a unique way, explore this statement, conversations that leaders aren't having.
Yeah, I'm really, really thankful to be invited, Jeff, and look forward to exploring here with you and perhaps recapping some of the experiences we've shared along the way. It's been a good ride, and we've really appreciated working with you and the team.
Yeah. So the question I ask all my guests right off the bat is this phrase, conversations that leaders aren't having. What's the first thing that comes to your mind when you hear that?
Well, it's interesting. I think a lot of what we tend to focus on as leaders, and certainly I did this early in my career, was we tend to focus on what our people are working on, the technical skills, how we're defining, in our case, it's a clinical research program, which institutions are we going to be working with, how quickly do we get them up, how quickly we get in the data and how clean is it, and so on. And of course, those are really important elements that we deliver in a really highly effective way. Patient safety relies on that, the integrity of the data and the research that we help biopharmaceutical companies conduct relies on that. But ultimately, when it comes to the experience that our employees have and their decision to be with us as a company, as opposed to any other organization in our industry, I get consistent feedback from those groups that really the thing that sets an employer apart is how we work, how we communicate with one another, how transparent we are, how collaborative it feels. Whether the person in the cube or the office next door or on the Teams call, really has a connection to me, and they understand who I am as a person, and I'm treated as an individual. So all of those elements, really tie into the how question rather than the what question. And I think when you get stressed or when you're overstretched as an organization, and obviously so many industries and companies are reporting how stretched and stressed the COVID environment, the labor market environment has created things. People tend, I think, to focus on what, and perhaps will lose the focus on how. And for me, that's the key element in defining an organization and its culture, its habits, its behaviors. Often those are connotated around soft things that can lose focus, and so those end up being conversations that, if you're not careful, you're not having as a leadership team, because you're focusing on the what and the here and now and the task. But it's really important, I think, that it's those conversations that are moved to the front, and they become foundational to being able to have a really healthy conversation about what you're working on, because you've got trust, you're making decisions together about what to prioritize, you've got a level of transparency across team members, across departments and functions and so on, that really drive a healthy discussion around not just what you're working on, but how you're doing it together. So that's really key for me.
Yeah. And, if I think back 2 years, it's just that's amazing. It's already been 2 years. But if I think back to one of our first conversations, what you just shared, it hasn't changed much. That you came in, you were about a year into your role as CEO of Catalyst at that point, but what you just shared is very consistent. And over, since our very first conversation in late October of 2019, I'm curious as what were the conversations that you were having then with your people, with the leadership team as it existed at that point? What were the conversations that you were having to help them see it the same way?
Yeah, well, we'll go into that. I want to bring another stakeholder group into the conversation as well, insofar as I had a board of directors and a group of investors that came in at the same time I became CEO, And so it wasn't just conversations around kind of long-term what we wanted to create as an organization with the management team, heavily involving those other stakeholders as well that had a vested interest in the outcome of the work that we're doing. So I'll talk a little bit about that after the management team. So as a management team, we were executing an acquisition and build strategy. So we knew we were going to be taking, in the initial incarnation, two companies that had different services, but there were synergies in those services, clinical and data orientated services. And we were going to be putting them together and then building additional capabilities around those with some smart hiring and some additional infrastructure in IT and our quality management system and so on. So, again, going back to my theme of, you can focus on what, and of course we had to do that. We had an integration plan and we had to figure out how our IT systems are going to talk to each other, what the financial accounting tools were going to be, how we're going to get invoices to clients, what quality management, as I said, what we were going to audit, what our SOPs look like and what have you. And that is, that can be overwhelming, a huge amount of activity in that. But I think it's really important that what we said and recognized from day one, actually before day one, when the management teams of the groups came together, was that we had to think about culture first and foremost. So we talked about how are we going to communicate with each other. Very different communication styles were brought up between the two organizations. Kind of one very kind of loosey-goosey and one a little bit more formalized, one very meeting orientated, another very email orientated. And you've got to figure those things out. Again, it's the how question that comes into this. And we spent an awful lot of time in those first few months talking about the behaviors and the kind of culture that we wanted the organization as it grew to have. So we're putting these two companies together. Our business plan said, okay, when we put these companies together, there's going to be a huge amount of additional demand for these new services in oncology research that we were going to be launching. And we didn't want our culture to evolve and become something that we didn't intend it to be 2 or 3 years later when you've grown and doubled in size and what have you. We wanted to be intentional about the culture that we created. And so even at a very early stage, we were saying, what kind of behaviors do we want to instill? What kind of behaviors do we want to hire for? And obviously that's what led me to reach out to you, because we said, okay, let's formalize that program. And that's actually invest some time and money in this at this stage, perhaps well ahead of when companies normally put that kind of program in place. We're putting it in place to allow us to build a foundation of behavior and shared values to the point that we've reached now, where we can look back and a lot of our staff have common language. There's a common management framework and set of tools our managers are using for those conversations that we want them to have with staff and with each other. There's a really solid foundation for that now, and I think we're reaping the reward for that investment at this point.
Yeah, and the consistency of the drumbeat. And a phrase you used, again, it probably was in that very first conversation, is build the roof before it rains. And that's been a drumbeat. And we could say, while business is good, Catalyst is thriving, it has rained. Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering, what have you seen during the rain? Labor tightness of the labor market, maybe projects, challenges on projects or with clients. What have you seen in terms of the fruit of that phrase, build the roof before it rains?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, somebody said to me many years ago, my job was to be the Mr. Miyagi of the organization, kind of wipe on, wipe off, and just the consistency of that. So that's always stuck with me, that's part of my role. When you're in a company and it flip-flops around what's the kind of the saying du jour and what's the initiative of the month and what have you, it feels quite disruptive in the organization if you don't have that continuity and consistency. And our strategies had that, and so our cultural alignment has that, and our goals and objectives as a company have had that now. So again, when I think about the relationship with the board of directors, they've been really instrumental in helping us to frame that as well, and supporting me and the management team in that consistency of goal and objective. Boards can sometimes be disruptive if they're all over the map, and I've been very fortunate to work with a group of leaders who haven't been that way with me or with us. But in terms of fixing the roof while the sun's shining, that we definitely have had common language to be able to lean back on. There are stressful times, a project where there's a huge amount of work to do, or a department which gets hit with unplanned work, and we need to deal with that. And the fact that I think our management team have been able to project high degree of humanity. We're all people, I think, in our team's eyes. We'll apologize when we don't get things right. I apologized last week for turning up at a meeting in a bit of a salty mood. So there's an element of humility and humbleness that goes along with that I think means that you end up having better dialogue across teams. People are more inclined to be open with you about where they're finding challenges with workload or technical issue, or how somebody's speaking to them, or whatever it might be. There's the ability to have that very transparent, open conversation, and then you can fix things together. Because it's very difficult to fix something, as we know, that you don't know about. But when you have a degree of, or a high degree of trust in the organization, people aren't shooting the messenger. They're appreciating feedback. We talk about feedback being a gift all of the time as one of our mantras. That really creates a very healthy environment to try to fix things together. We don't always get it right, and there have been departments that have been hit with tidal waves of work that we didn't anticipate, and staff feeling that they're burned out on occasions and what have you. But every one of those people, at our heart, we care about them. It's not like they're just looking at them and saying, well, kind of get on with it. We genuinely care, and then try to resolve that.
Yeah, and there's an expression that I use about values. Values aren't really your values until they're tested. And if values just are a plaque in the wall and are pulled off the wall, oh, what were they when it's tough times? They're not going to stand the test. And what strikes me, Nick, is that the fact that your values have been your values, maybe some slightly different words, but your values have been your values since I've known you. They were in the formative phase, but they were there two years ago. That the fact that they've been there, and you've done the Mr. Miyagi on the values over the 2 years when they have been tested, that they've stood the test, they've stood up to the test. And yeah. I'm wondering if you can maybe take one value and talk about that. But I'm wondering how you've seen the values tested and come through that test.
Yeah, I mean, we chose for various reasons to focus in on 5 values or behaviors, things that were core, and we didn't just abstractly choose them. They're things I think that as a group of leaders, we'd all seen were incredibly important for both employee and customer experience in former lives. Yeah. So we felt that they were going to be intrinsically important to how we operated as a company. And so they aren't just words. At the end of the day, they're truly deeply held beliefs on what's important in a company. And alongside the values that integrity is really important as well. That's not one of our values because we believe you've either got it or you haven't. But that's another one of those things that you've got to truly believe that if you've got integrity, you then have to do the right thing. Even if it's not in the best interest of your financial performance or whatever it might be, you've got to do the right thing. And people are looking for that all of the time. They're looking for signals that these words that you've put on a wall or a sticker, that they're actually things that are truly, truly deeply held beliefs and the actions that go along with that. So I think that's been really important that we pulled those through them. They are beliefs and they've guided us in certain decisions. When we're left with a decision where there isn't a perfect answer, where there are conflicting options, our values guide us on that. When we've got a customer that wants to do a new study with us, and we don't have the staff to be able to pick that work up and effectively execute it, the ability to collaborate across the groups that have got a stake in that, come to a final answer and then hold ourselves to account in turning away a very lucrative piece of business and everybody getting behind that decision. Collaboration is one of our values, and our teams operate with a really high degree of collaborative spirit. When a salesperson is turning away a multi-million-dollar contract, that's going to personally benefit them financially, but they get behind the decision that we're not going to do that because we're putting our employees first, we're putting customer service and execution first, and we don't want to be that high sales but no execution company. That's a testament to that collaborative spirit and that value being brought into play in those daily operations.
Mm. And I'm wondering, what's the, for lack of a better word, feedback? What are you hearing when a value is tested, and you, as you named one of the tests is, okay, we're going to turn some business away. When you do that and make those type of value driven decisions, what's the feedback that you hear from your people when that happens, or when you do that?
Yeah, I mean, during the process, obviously you've got different stakeholders weighing in, and you get that, what I always call healthy tension between roles in an organization that keep you honest, keep you innovating, keep you thinking about how you could do things, being creative, etc. But once the decision gets made, huge amount of relief. I've been told many times over the last several months how proud people are to work for a company that actually does what it says, that will actually turn away work if it can't execute, instead of just playing lip service to, that's what we would do in theory if this ever came to happen. And here we've experienced it, and we've done what we said from the get-go we were going to do. I think people feel a degree of pride because our values and our behaviors that we've articulated these last 2 years have become real expressions of what we do and how we do it.
Yeah, man, I just can't imagine what it does to your heart when you hear, I'm proud to work at Catalyst because we do what we say we believe in. And I mean, I'm at 10,000 feet, as I often say, to the Catalyst story, and my heart bursts when I hear you say that, like bursts with pride. So I can't imagine what it means for you and your immediate leadership team when you hear those words.
Yeah, I mean, it's gratifying. It's hard sometimes to do the right thing. But I used to have this saying, a lot of my analogies and my stories at work are sport related. So in England, there's this sport called cricket, which I know Americans just don't understand. But if you play correctly and technically when you're batting, you play with a straight bat, and it means you always hit the ball true. And a former colleague of mine and an old team member, we used to talk when we got hard decisions about just play it with a straight bat, just be open and honest with yourself about what your principles are guiding you to do, and you're not going to slice the ball as a result. You're going to play it true and fair. And I think back to that statement: just play with a straight bat. Don't overcomplicate things. Try and do the right thing based on your values and your principles, and that's going to be a good way of dealing with vast majority of things. Not to overcomplicate it, just do what you think is the right thing and play with that straight bat.
I love that. I love that expression. You mentioned integrity before as not one of the 5 core values, but just this underlying, almost unspoken, that's not exactly true, but this underlying principle that drives you and everything you do. And another one of those that's not one of the 5 core values is people first. And a lot of, just like integrity, a lot of companies say integrity, they say people first. What makes that principle, that belief in people first, what do you sense makes that unique in the corporate world?
Yeah, I don't know that I'd say it's unique, Jeff. I would say that it's something we try to make action, in action, not words. I think a lot of really healthy, successful companies are able to execute on that. A lot of companies will say it's people first because it's the right thing to say. It's kind of almost become like the mantra or the blueprint for companies. But actually putting that into action is much harder than putting it into words. So it's something that we talk about as a management team or management teams across the organization. It doesn't mean be exclusively and just about your employees, right? And I think that's really important because it can get translated into you're only focused on your employees. And of course, you've got other stakeholders. We've got customers that we need to serve. We have sites, medical research sites we work with. We need to serve them. And ultimately, that's in the benefit of patients that are on the therapies that we're helping to deploy. So there's a bigger purpose here. We've got shareholders that have invested in the company that we need to make sure that we're serving and doing the right thing by as well. So it's not an exclusivity, but it's an order of impact. Because our belief is that if we do the right thing for our people, that will create an environment where those individuals are able to work most effectively for our customers.
Yes.
And in doing that, we serve those patients that I described earlier. And we believe over the long run, that creates a better return for people that have invested in our company, because we'll grow and we'll be healthy and we'll be profitable. We may not, in a moment be, within 2 or 5 or whatever percentage of what we could have squeezed out of the stone. But this is a long-term project. It's the infinite game of being the best company we can be. And so it's about an ordering of review. So when somebody says, I've got an idea, let's do X, whether it's an IT system or a process tweak, we have coached ourselves to ask, what impact does that have on our employees? And if it's good for our employees, then great. If it's going to be bad for our employees, is there a way to mitigate that? Do we have to go down that road? What's the impact if we don't do that at all? Right. And I think that that then becomes it just becomes an order of evaluation where we're constantly saying, okay, how do we create the best environment for our employees to be effective within? And from that, all other good things will flow. And so it becomes a guiding set of kind of principles for us as a team to how we step into decision making.
Yeah, and this people-centered, the word that this principle may be people first, but it's just this people-centered or people-oriented way of making decisions and operating. And I think all of your values reflect, all 5 of the values reflect maybe the most specific, the one that resonates for me the most is connected around just being people-centered is flexibility. And I'm wondering, how do you explain to a new employee or to an investor or to a client even, how do you explain that particular value?
Yeah, it's a hard one because flexibility actually ends up going both ways. The way I like, again, I tend to oversimplify things, but most at the heart of most of the things that employees say to me they want is that they want to be treated like a person, and they want to be treated the way I might want to treat myself. So there's just a high degree of just people treating people like people, like you would do a family member. And so in that context, you then step into, you've got to understand what somebody's trying to achieve to be able to then give them the environment or the answer to a question that they're looking for. And so you're always asking questions. So how does that translate practically into something, vacation, PTO? We don't have a defined, you've only got 10 days of PTO that you can take, and that has to encompass vacation. It might have a minimum number of sick days in there, but then you've got jury duty and you've got some military reserve personnel that needs but sometimes to be deployed. There's all maternity and paternity leave and so on and so forth. So all sorts of different elements that play into that. And so what we've done is we've tried to say, okay, any given year is not going to be the same for any of us as individuals. So let's have a discretionary PTO policy so that people can take more time in a year where they might have a wedding or a child arrives or whatever might be happening in their family environment. But let's try to mitigate the downside of many discretionary PTO models where people don't take enough vacation. So you end up in an unhealthy situation. So we've said, okay, let's monitor and let's report on the minimum number of expected days that you would anticipate that somebody will take. Let's equip line managers with that insight. so that they can then coach their employees into taking some time if they haven't taken enough. But we've also got the ability to kind of go up and down. And that's that flexibility in action where you get to know one another and you make people-based decisions. So there's a practical example of that. I mean, other things that we've looked at during the COVID period were, people just weren't taking vacation. So we started to say, okay, let's give those insights. What percentage of our employees have taken a minimum of 12 vacation days in a calendar year on top of our Christmas or holiday close down, which is 5 days, and our other company holidays and so on. So that would add up to everybody taking about 23 days off in a calendar year, which I think is quite a healthy amount, particularly in North America. And so we try to really employ that. And about 80% of our staff have had that 23 days off in total. Again, pretty healthy environment for us to try to create, and a constant reminder for ourselves and our management teams as what the kind of minimum expectations are around taking a healthy amount of time away from work.
Yeah, and one of the principles that we work together to create for the culture is know and love our people, and it really speaks to that comes even before this notion of flexibility. Is in order to be in the practice of flexibility or any of the values, you really have to know and deeply care, if dare we say love, but really know your people, and it has to go so far beyond a transaction of, okay, you clock in for 40 hours and you get a check every 2 weeks. It just really speaks to how critical that underlying principle of the culture is.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, at the end of the day, not every employee wants to have a deep and meaningful relationship with their boss. But I do think every employee wants to know that they're cared about, that they're not just a number, not just a cog in a machine, that there's a personal commitment to them. And that's what that value and that element of our management and culture framework instills a constant understanding across our teams that we have to engage with our employees and invest in them. There's an emotional investment that we make in those folk, and I think that comes through. And again, that's different to being in a large organization where you're just a cog in the wheel. You've found a home here. I hope that every one of our team members feels that they're at home in our organization. We all spend enough time here together. So doing that, spending that time with people that appreciate you as a person, I think is a critical part, again, of that culture of kind of safeness and trust that we try to create.
Yeah, it reminds me of another one of your phrases that echoes in my mind all the time, and that's a leader's job is to put oxygen in the room. And again, that's a phrase you've been saying to me for as long as we've known each other over the last 2 years. I'm wondering how do you have a conversation with another leader who maybe is new to Catalyst? How do you help them? What's the conversation you're having to help them understand what that really means?
Yeah, it's a good one. I do use that phrase a lot. For me, it's useful in a number of different realms because none of us can see or touch oxygen, right? And so that's the same with leadership. It's very hard to tangibly see or touch good leadership in action. But the reality, when we start thinking about how we work rather than what we do, when we reach a certain point in our careers, we're no longer the candles burning bright. The brightest candles in the room, the technical experts, the people that are getting the clinical trials in our case executed on behalf of our clients. It's not me anymore. So how do I create a framework and describe what my role is when my job is actually quite challenging to say I can touch or feel that? But we can see when you've got oxygen in the room because the candle burns brighter. Our teams are able to be more effective. We've put tools in people's hands that allow them to do a better job. We've created an environment where they're supported and appreciated, where they can do their best work. And that's those candles burning brightly. And so being able to explain that to new leaders, that their job is to help me put as much oxygen into the room, create this culture and this execution, effective execution culture and an environment.
Yes.
That's that transition away from doing the work, being the candle, to being the oxygen. And it seems to work pretty well in being able to convey this, kind of ethereal element that is very intentional, but at the end of the day, it's a product of many, many little things, many little actions, many little conversations, taking the time to reach out, check in, make sure somebody's okay, etc. It's just a product of all of those little things that are intangible on their own, but add up to all of that oxygen being in the room for our organization.
It strikes me, an expression that I try to live by is, look at the fruit. You will know how you're doing by the fruit. And the fruit, as you're describing it, working with other leaders at Catalyst, is, are they energized? Are they bright? Even their disposition, their attitude. It's such a simple, natural order, natural law perspective, but we can see how we're doing as leaders by the fruit of our people. And are they releasing all that discretionary resource that they can only volunteer?
Mm-hmm.
And so it strikes me that this picture that with this phrase, a leader's job is to put oxygen in the room. Yeah, you can't see the oxygen, but you can see the fruit of having the oxygen, or whatever that might exactly be. What the fruit of that is having that in the room.
You can see the product of that. And again, we don't get it right all of the time. You can also see when it's not working. Right? And again, we've had teams where they've been hit by unplanned work, or we haven't been able to line things up as effectively as we needed to. But I would say that, we've been open about that, and we've said, look, we didn't get this right. That's also part of that openness. When things don't go according to plan, you've got to be able to admit that. Otherwise, then all of the other words come across as hollow. So there have been many, many times in the last 3 years we haven't got things right. But I think we've tried really hard from the heart to do the right thing all of the time, even if it didn't turn out exactly as we planned. And I think people can see that. And the fruit of that is that in the main, our people are committed, and they're motivated, and they believe in what we've got going on, and they're on board for the journey. And even if they're tired out at times, they're excited about the future. And that is the fruit of that labor. And we don't want people to feel burned out. In fact, we'd love to get to a point where we can hire and train and onboard fast enough where nobody felt that they were doing more work than they should be. So that again, that's us trying to walk the walk in being a good employer, making sure we've got the right staff in place, and then making sure that we're delivering for all of those stakeholders.
Yeah, I'm wondering, your view on culture has matured into where it is today. I'm wondering, how has your view of culture changed over the last decade? So if you think of how you were seeing it 10 years ago, how is it different than it is today?
Yeah, it's a great. It is a great question, and I think many people that have kind of grown into a CEO role from individual function leadership, whatever the career path would be, you would probably say the same thing. It is, going back to that candle in a room, hopefully with oxygen. That back 10 years ago, I would have said that having 10 candles burning brightly was culture. It was what we were doing. It's what we were all doing that drove culture. It was those elements. And really, my journey personally has been about really understanding and recognizing and embracing the fact that the air is the culture. It isn't the candles. The air is what makes those candles burn, not the wick. And so that's really been the journey of discovery, to then say, okay, how do you make sure that you're paying attention to all those little things, as I mentioned earlier, the intangibles that add up in where the sum of the parts are greater than the individuals themselves. But how do you make sure you're paying attention to all those little things so they do add up and become that an enabling group of activities?
Yeah. And you mentioned before all the stakeholders that you have. In my experience, oftentimes clients and investors are almost exclusively interested in the what. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned, you alluded to the conversations with the board, with the investment group. What are the conversations that you have with those other stakeholders? So the clients and the board, what are the conversations that you had or are having about culture with them so that they also see, it is about the how, it's not just about the what?
Yeah, so the board is a really accomplished and experienced group of folks that have run companies. They've been CEOs, they've been big global head roles in biopharma and so on. So I'm lucky in that we've got a team of people that work with me and with us as a management team that are really recognize that you create shareholder value from the work you do, and the work you do is heavily influenced by the culture and the hows, not just the what. So really heavily experienced, high experienced group. So that hasn't been a major roadblock. And in fact, the PE group that we work with have a management system that they use with portfolio companies that's heavily lined up around clarity of role and responsibility, decision rights, accountability, clarity around performance of the different groups, and so on. So that all helps to inform in a kind of a tangible way many of the elements that we've embraced also when we thought, let's have a strong culture. There is clarity, there are agreements amongst groups about what we need to do for one another, which is all drives trust and so on. So from that perspective, we've had an operating partner at NovaQuest that's really contributed to that along the way. With respect to clients, I think you do end up stepping into conversations around the ramifications of just focusing on what, because our industry, I think, has a bit of a reputation for being a high turnover industry. Kind of 15, 18, 20% of companies' employee base can leave in a revolving door on an annual basis in many CROs. And we've been lucky enough to have experienced less than 2% turnover in each of the last 3 years that I've been here. And so there's a product of the focus here on culture that I hope is a big driver, or at least a partial driver of that strong retention result. And the beneficiaries of that strong retention are our customers. Yeah. And they are the sites we're working with, and they are ultimately the patients that we serve, who are benefiting from access to these therapies, because we haven't had to keep stopping and starting because you're training new reams and reams of new people. And so when you're able to step into the story around why it's important that you focus on how, because it creates a foundation for you being able to do the what to the best possible of your ability. That resonates pretty well with clients. When you step in, you take the time to tell that story.
Yeah. And when you have all of these stakeholders on board with what and how you're trying to accomplish it, it's there's no better place to be for a team member when all of that is aligned in nodding their heads in agreement and then willing to live it out. Absolutely. So we could talk. I know we could talk all day, and we'll have, maybe we do part 2 of this. But what I'd like to finish with is again a question I ask all my guests: the conversation that you would have with your pre-CEO self. If you could pull him aside and have a conversation with him, given what you know today, what's the conversation that you would have with him?
So I guess it would be a little advice. just to make that journey maybe a little easier, maybe a few less bumps along the way. I think in common with many CEOs, you get to a point where you've built a great team around you and your roles evolved. And you look around and you actually try to think, what is my role? Yeah, I've got a great team. They're doing all the things that they need to do. You don't need to go and micromanage. You counsel yourself not to micromanage. You let people do what they do, and you end up with a role that's made up with lots and lots of little pieces. It's this series of intangibles. It's calling somebody and checking in to see how they're doing, or it's asking a question about how a process or a contract is doing. But lots and lots of informal pieces that add up to the role. And really, I guess the advice I've given myself is get used to or get comfortable with the fact you don't have a task role anymore. And it comes back to that being the oxygen in the room. It's intangible, and you need to go where you need to go and be what you need to be. Support people. Step in when you need to lend a hand, be a servant, if you will, to your team. Get comfortable with that, and it's okay to be that kind of intangible leader that just goes where you need to go in the organization.
Yeah, there's a phrase that I try to live by: let the greatest among you be the servant of all. And it really feels like that, being a servant, being, to be able to provide for those legitimate needs of those who are entrusted into your stewardship is and to get comfortable with that's great advice for younger you and for any CEOs, newer aspiring CEOs who might be watching. Nick, this again, I just echo what I said at the outset, real pleasure for us to spend this time together. For those that are watching and would like to know more about you or know more about Catalyst, where can they find that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we have our website, which is catalystcr.com. Certainly you can see more about what we do and our leaders. Also, I'm on LinkedIn, like so many people in this day and age. You can find me out there, Nick Dyer, and obviously the role here as CEO at Catalyst. I would just like to say thank you to you and your team. It's been a real pleasure working with you these last 2 years and change. We've done some awesome things together, and it's really been greatly appreciated and a very enjoyable part of the journey.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Nick.